Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is quietly checking their bag for a tampon, hoping nobody notices. Maybe they're hiding a pad up their sleeve on the way to the bathroom. Maybe they're just not talking about it, even though it's happening to roughly half the human population every single month for most of their adult lives. It's one of the most universal experiences a human body can have, and somehow it's also one of the most secretive. But here's the question that actually matters. Was it always like this? Did ancient women hide it too? Or is the shame we associate with periods today actually a relatively recent invention? Let's go back, way back, before pads, before tampons, before the word period even existed as a polite substitute for what people were too uncomfortable to say directly. The oldest evidence we have comes from ancient Egypt, more than 3,000 years ago. And what they used is honestly kind of brilliant for the time. Egyptian women took softened papyrus, the same plant they used to make paper, and rolled it into something remarkably close to a modern tampon. This wasn't some crude, desperate workaround. It was a functional, reusable solution, refined enough that historians consider it one of the earliest recorded pieces of medical technology designed specifically for a woman's body. And it wasn't seen as shameful. In fact, in ancient Egypt, menstruation was often connected to fertility, to the body's link with nature and the rhythms of the world around it. It wasn't hidden the way it often is today. It was just a fact of life, one that happened to come with a clever practical solution. Now travel a bit further, to ancient Greece. Here things get more complicated, and honestly, more revealing about how attitudes shift depending on who's writing the history. Greek women used rolled lint wrapped around small pieces of wood, sometimes referred to as motos, essentially handmade absorbent rods, not too far off conceptually from a modern tampon. Some also used sea sponges, naturally absorbent, and frankly, ahead of their time. But alongside these practical solutions, Greek culture also started attaching something else to menstruation: fear. Temples posted inscriptions at their entrances warning menstruating women to stay away, treating the blood as something that could spiritually contaminate a sacred space. This is one of the earliest written examples we have of menstruation being framed not just as biological, but as dangerous. Not dirty in a hygiene sense, dangerous in a supernatural one, which is a strange thing to sit with. The exact same bodily process, handled with clever, practical tools in one culture, was simultaneously being treated as something that could offend the gods in another. Rome took a slightly different, almost contradictory approach. Roman women used wool as padding, sometimes reed-like plant material for extra absorption. But Rome's relationship with menstruation was oddly two-faced. On one hand, Pliny the Elder, a Roman scholar, wrote about menstrual blood in genuinely bizarre terms, claiming it could dull mirrors, kill crops, and even drive dogs mad. On the other hand, priestesses in Rome were still expected to perform their sacred temple duties even while menstruating. No exceptions, no seclusion. So depending on whether you were a farmer's wife or a temple priestess, your period was either treated as a minor curse on the household, or just Tuesday. Meanwhile, across the ocean, in cultures with no contact with Greece or Rome at all, women were solving the exact same problem with the materials available to them. In parts of ancient equatorial Africa, women used rolled grass and woven grass mats. In early Japan, rolled paper. Different continents, different eras, zero communication between them, and yet the core idea kept reappearing again and again. Find something absorbent, something you have access to, and adapt it to your body. This wasn't one culture's clever idea copied by others. This was the same problem being solved independently, over and over, everywhere humans existed. Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because remember, this entire video started with the assumption that ancient societies must have looked at periods with disgust. But that assumption might actually be backwards. One historian, writing about ancient stigma, points out something worth sitting with. It's highly unlikely that early humans, hunter-gatherers focused entirely on survival, treated a monthly bodily process as some deep source of shame. When you're worried about predators, food, and shelter, a period is just something that happens, a practical inconvenience to manage, not a moral failing to hide. So if the earliest humans probably weren't ashamed, And even sophisticated Bronze Age Egyptians treated it as a normal, manageable part of life. Where did the shame actually come from? The turning point seems to trace back to exactly what we just saw in Greece and Rome, the moment menstruation stopped being purely practical and started being wrapped in religious and mystical meaning. Once something gets tangled up with ideas of purity, contamination, and the supernatural, it stops being a body process and starts being a moral one. And once it's moral, it's a very short step to shame. That shift accelerated hard during the medieval period in Europe. This is where things took a genuinely dark turn. Menstrual blood, once viewed by some ancient cultures as connected to fertility and even sacred power, was now being blamed for spoiling crops, curdling milk, dulling knives, and, in some truly wild medieval beliefs, giving women the power to poison a man just by looking at him during her cycle. Read that again. An entire body of European folklore developed around the idea that a menstruating woman's gaze alone could be dangerous. And as the mysticism around periods grew darker, the actual solutions got worse. During the Middle Ages, and well into the following centuries, menstrual products barely evolved past scraps of cloth and rags, hidden and washed in secret. Not because humanity forgot how to innovate, we were building cathedrals and sailing across oceans during this same period, but because menstruation had been pushed so far into taboo territory that improving it publicly wasn't something anyone was willing to be associated with. It's a strange kind of regression. Ancient Egyptians, 3,000 years earlier, had already engineered a reasonably sophisticated absorbent product, and yet centuries later, women in parts of Europe were using little more than folded rags, not because the knowledge had been lost, but because shame had made the entire subject nearly impossible to discuss, let alone improve. It would take until the industrial era for menstrual products to meaningfully advance again. Cloth pads held in place with belts, and eventually, in the 20th century, the commercial products we'd actually recognize today. But even then, secrecy stuck around. Advertisements for early sanitary products used vague, euphemistic language for decades, because companies knew the word period itself made people uncomfortable to even read in print. So, when you really zoom out on this whole timeline, something interesting emerges. The shame isn't ancient. The shame isn't universal. It's not even consistent. It appears in some cultures and eras and is completely absent in others, sometimes just a few hundred miles apart. What is universal is the practical ingenuity. Women in wildly different times and places, with zero communication between them, independently arriving at similar solutions to the same problem, using whatever their environment gave them: papyrus, wool, sponges, grass, paper. The tools evolved constantly. The stigma came and went depending entirely on who was in charge of the story, and if a Bronze Age Egyptian woman could walk you through her papyrus tampon with the same casualness you'd explain a shopping list, maybe the discomfort we've inherited today says a lot less about the body itself, and a lot more about which centuries decided to be afraid of it.